As is probably clear by now, I grew up in this congregation. Back when we still met at the senior center, I participated in coming of age as an 8th grader. During those months, my small coming of age class learned, talked, listened, and thought about what each of us believed and what Unitarian Universalism meant to each of us. At that point in my life, the defining focal points for my passions and interests were trees, French horns, and, of course, Orlando Bloom. I recall trying to identify what I believed, but had a hard time coming up with anything. I kept getting stuck on the big questions of does God exist and what happens after you die, both of which I, of course, have yet to reach a definitive answer. I recall being grateful that there was no pressure on me to come up with any definitive answers. But still, I figured that these questions are really the most important in order to ever figure out what I believe. Unitarian Universalism, of course, means different things to different people, and it certainly means something different to me now than it did 12 years ago. When I was 13, I was most drawn to our 4th principle. I thought that's the one that, for me, was the most characteristic of Unitarian Universalism, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, a lifelong quest to determine what you believe. Over the years, though, that feeling has changed. I have become more aware of the world around me, more tuned in to lives beyond my own. Reading the newspaper, I learned about the problems our community, our country, and our world faces. Throughout my life, my UU faith had taught me the importance of treating people with compassion and giving everyone a chance to form their own opinions and let their voice be heard. As I grew older and learned about all of these great inequalities and injustices, I think it was natural for me to feel compelled to do something about them. During my 3rd year of college, I studied abroad in the West African country of Cameroon. It is a developing country, but it is also a beautiful and diverse country full of hardworking, kind people. And for perhaps the first time in my life, I was immediately confronted with the enormity of global inequality. The clear development disparity between Cameroon and my home country was impossible to ignore. But as much as I felt out of my comfort zone in the country, I couldn't have felt more at home with the family that I lived with. Even though I started off as a complete stranger and a crazy American college student at that, they welcomed me into their home and cared for me, and over the couple of months that I was there, loved me like a sister and a daughter. I've been puzzling recently over why exactly it is that I care so much about engaging with the wider world and the interdependence between all of us. And I think it's because I can't help thinking about my host family in Cameroon and how the entire world is filled with all of these wonderful, loving families and fantastic dancers and poets and soccer prodigies and amateur artists, women with smiles that light up the room, and children learning to walk, struggling to pass math, and frustrating their parents by staying out too late with their friends. And it is our responsibility as global citizens to care about all of these people as we would care about our next-door neighbors. In some ways, modern times have made our planet more and more interconnected. But with all this connectedness and modernization, the gaps in real understanding and empathy are also growing wider and wider. The recent currency crisis in India gives a perfect example of how, in efforts to modernize a country, those in the bottom ranks get left behind with no way to rise out of their poverty. Exactly 2 months ago today, on the same day as our own presidential election, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi unexpectedly announced a new policy that effectively demonetized 86% of the currency by the end of the day. Within 3 hours, all 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, which is approximately like the $10 and $20 bills, were from that point on illegal currency and had to be exchanged for new ones. The Unitarian Universalist Holding India program works with grassroots organizers on the ground in India and had a first-hand look at the immediate effects of this demonetization. Most people that the holding program's partners work with are part of the poorest sections of India's citizenry. People without bank accounts who rely entirely on cash in the informal economy. The demonetization was cast as an effort to eliminate black money and move India toward a cashless economy. However, as we have seen in the last 2 months since the launch of this new policy, hours-long ATM lines and banks running out of the new notes have wreaked havoc on the livelihoods of those who depend on cash to survive. As it turned out, the poor have been the hardest hit by this change. Workers and day laborers are unable to find jobs or are being offered payment in the old currency. Meanwhile, the wealthy in India have more or less been okay, already relying largely on credit cards and online payments to conduct their business. These types of authoritarian reforms mean that inequality only grows. It is common for declarations and constitutions throughout the world to make grand statements about equality between their citizens. The first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Our own U.S. Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. Equal, right? Okay, so what does that mean? In our efforts to acknowledge the humanity in everyone, we make the mistake of ignoring context. We may be created equal in potential, but the reality is we are not created equal in opportunity. We are born free and equal in dignity and rights, or as our own principles say, we all have inherent worth and dignity. But that doesn't mean we all have an equal shot, an equal opportunity. We hear examples of people pulling themselves up by their proverbial bootstraps. So if some people can do it, why can't we all? We say that everyone is equal, and because, at least on paper, we are all subject to the same laws, hey, there it is, equality. But of course, laws on paper and laws as they are enforced are very different things. But still, we have this mentality of merit as a determinant for social status. If you're poor, it's understood that you didn't try hard enough. We all started off with an equal shot, so if you didn't make it, maybe you don't deserve it. But we don't really all have an equal shot. Equality doesn't mean anything unless you have truly equal opportunities. The UU United Nations Office's Intergenerational Spring Seminar this past year focused on the intersection of economic inequality with racial discrimination. One of the speakers, a teacher in a predominantly African American inner city high school, told us about one of his students who had written a powerful and beautiful poem for another class. Because the student used slang words and he didn't dot his I's, the teacher covered it with red marks and gave it a poor grade. The student was writing from his heart, from the only context he knows, and his teacher wanted grammatical perfection. She didn't understand that sonnets and 19th century style British prose have no relevance to the student's life in West Baltimore. Because the education system did not accommodate the context from which its students arrived, they were forced to fail. All students are taught more or less the same lessons, but without accounting for differences in culture and experience, what seems on paper like equal opportunity is actually perpetuating deep inequality. In order to reduce some of this pervasive inequality that appears in all aspects of our lives, the United Nations is focusing on promoting sustainable development, which actually refers to a lot more than just environmental sustainability. You may have heard that in 2015, the UN adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are basically an action plan to make the planet more just, equitable, safe, and livable. The 193 countries of the UN recognize that no one country can achieve success alone. The interesting thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, as opposed to the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them, is that the SDGs are not primarily focused on the developing world. The SDGs are for all of us, just like our planet is. So all of these countries have agreed to contribute to achieving these 17 goals in the next 15 years. I've been throwing around a lot of numbers and acronyms right now, but here's what is important. The Sustainable Development Goals are not about the numbers. They're not just about countries negotiating and signing declarations. The SDGs are about the whole world working together. They're not just about Malawi trying to lower its HIV infection rate. They're about a collaboration of innovators from around the world working together to provide HIV treatment to rural women worldwide who can't afford it. They're about creating a space on an international level to share techniques for lowering carbon emissions, and countries holding each other accountable for the commitments that they've made. Most importantly, the Sustainable Development Goals are about each of us making a small difference in our local context, and that action having a global impact because the whole world is working on it. Maybe because I work in the UN Church Center in the Unitarian Universalist office, right across the street from the UN, but I can't help but feel that Unitarian Universalism is a very UN-compatible religion. And I personally feel like my faith is not just based off of the 7 principles and 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism, but also the 9 lines in the UN Charter and the 32 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Over the years, I've begun to see my religion as less concerned with questions of what happens when we die, but rather how should we treat each other as we go about our lives here on earth, and what is our relationship with other human beings and other animals, plants, air, land, water. Rather than focusing on the quest to answer unanswerable questions, I've decided UUism, for me, is really all about our 6th principle, the goal of world community, with peace, liberty, and justice for all. You may have heard the phrase, think globally, act locally. It's a nice idea, and maybe we need to dig a little deeper to get to the actual meaning behind the catchphrase. Think globally, act locally generally conveys a sense of looking at the big picture, but focusing on just a small portion of it. Beyond just a catchy slogan, it's also a pretty useful tool for social justice action. Thinking globally means intentionally learning about the world and about things taking place outside of the United States. When that happens, it becomes clear that many other countries' problems echo our own. And they are not only similar issues, but related issues. Our inequality in the US is caused by, but also reinforces inequality in other parts of the world. By thinking globally, we become more fully aware of how interdependent life on Earth is. We also become more aware of what steps might be possible to start moving toward a more compassionate world community, with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And then choose something you're passionate about. If you're already working on Black Lives Matter related issues, take a look at the report issued by the UN's Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. They recently visited the United States and submitted a report of observations and recommendations to the UN Human Rights Council. Use that as a tool in your advocacy. I've already mentioned how the Sustainable Development Goals provide a perfect opportunity to act locally but have a global impact. Consider how systemic racism relates to Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is to ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. How, in our communities, can we work to make inclusive education systems with content that is relevant and applicable to students' lives? Perhaps you're passionate about gender equality and reducing violence against women. First off, if you are, you definitely should attend the 3rd International UU Women's Convocation, which is in California this February. But aside from that, you've perhaps heard of something called CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's one of the UN conventions that the US government has failed to ratify. There's an ongoing campaign called Cities for CEDAW, aiming to protect women and girls' rights by passing legislation in cities and towns, establishing the principles of CEDAW across the United States. especially in a time like this when our federal government policy feels so out of reach and out of touch. Working on a local level might mean a realistic but also real opportunity for progress. A number of cities around the U.S. have already adopted CEDAW as a city ordinance, and many more are on their way to doing so. Perhaps Thousand Oaks can be next on that list. Although these are global goals, there's no reason not to start small. Start in your family. Start in your congregation or at the company you work for. Even if you already feel pretty good about the gender balance of your local leadership, make it official. Adopt an explicit statement affirming CEDAW so the rest of the world knows you're being intentional about trying to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. Every small step we make locally toward one of these sustainable development goals is not just bringing us closer to achieving the goals we've committed to, but in the process, we're also improving lives. Even if we don't get all the way there, we've at least made a dent. It's up to us to determine how big our dent will be. Let our community, our local community, our global world community, be one in which we fully appreciate our dependence on each other. As the Universal Declaration of Human Rights tells us, we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. We are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. May it be so. Blessed be.